Good morning. My name is James Abraham. I'm the founder of Minzo. Let me start with an apology. I'm an engineer. That's a confession. I will need to bring that back up later, so I thought it would be very good to be up front. Several years ago, I was asked a very interesting question, or a surprising question. I was asked, how do we get individuals, masses of people, engaged intimately in this journey of solving the climate crisis? Now, I have to tell you, my co-founder Tanya and I had spent more than a decade building solar power plants, displacing coal in our country, involved in climate negotiations, helping companies with their journey on climate. So we thought we were already engaged. But this phrase, more intimately engaged in our lives, really caught us. And when we looked at ourselves, we realized, actually, we were not that intimately engaged. So we asked ourselves why. And we fell onto the language that we use when we describe climate. It's very big language. Global temperatures, weather patterns, energy transition, phase down. Apparently, I'm allowed to say phase down and not phase out, but we'll talk about that later. Phase down of fossil fuels. This is a language that keeps the individual out of it. It's very difficult to find ourselves in there when there's billions of dollars at stake and time frames are lifetimes away. And as an individual, when you look at this, we're left with sometimes fear, sometimes helplessness, and maybe a little bit of activism. So we said if we had to solve this, we had to find a way to make actions atomic so we could act. We had to find a way to make time frames near so we could visualize it. And we had to make the funds required within our grasp so we could afford it. So here's where the apology comes in. As I said, I'm an engineer. My answer to these questions does not move towards art or film or policy or regulation. We tend to build things. So we built a personal emissions tracker, and I did this on my own life. I measured everything I did and converted it into emissions. If you want to do something depressing in your life, do this. So you see that really nice green tree? Some days are like that. It's a good day, low emissions, but most of my days, my emissions were so high, the landscape was barren and the tree was desiccated. When I looked at my own climate identity, my own climate story, I was the villain in this story. And I wanted to change this. So I dug deep into the data, and I found there were some things I could do. And it was interesting. But the real magic is what's happening here now. Some of you are curious. You're asking, is that possible? Is that something I could do? Wow, if we could only get this together. Same thing happened in my team. We all started asking ourselves what this means. We broke this up. We created a score to allow us to compare ourselves to each other. We broke up our emissions, personal versus professional, the stuff that had to do with work. We looked at our trend lines. We became a community in conversation with real personal data. And when we became a community in conversation with real personal data, we became a community in action. Many of you have step trackers and calorie counters. You all share these step trackers and calorie counters. You become communities in action when you've got data about yourself and you're sharing it with each other. As we became communities in action, we found ways to change our own emissions story. We found that there were some emissions that were, like that really amazing dessert that you just cannot give up that spikes your blood sugar. It spiked our emissions. And there were other types of emissions that are just habits, and I'm not going to give you an analogy of bad habits, we all have them. So those habits were things that we needed to change over time. As we dug deep into this, especially our professional emissions, we changed the way we commuted. We looked at work from home versus work from office. We became much more sensitive and aware of the options around us as our cities were introducing new forms of public transit, electric buses and such. We got engaged with that. Of course, we still continue composting and recycling, which, by the way, great things to do. Please keep doing them. But we were able to go much further on those avenues. We started to become more sensitive about waste, water, plastic. Perhaps most importantly, especially for the politicians that were up here, we became aware of our options at the voting booth. And that became a part of our conversation. So we finally found ways to get more engaged in this. And we started to reduce our emissions, and it was exciting for a while. 6 months into this, I found I started to plateau out. I don't like plateauing. I needed to get to the next stage, so I adopted another great phrase that we have in climate, net zero. Remember net zero? Very big word, but I said, I want to make this personal. How do we get to personal net zero? So I took the emissions and I said, I want to get to net zero by 2030, not some faraway goal, but something more within, personally, my lifetime. And I said, what would happen to my emissions if I did nothing? Can I project it? You know, Ari and Catherine this morning said that our future is less dystopian than we think. I found that answer. I found that left to itself, my emissions would reduce by 30% just because of all the work you're doing. Our grid is getting more green. Our transportation is getting better. Airlines are thinking about using new forms of tech and fuel. It's all changing around us. That our future looks actually brighter, and I could see it in my numbers. But it wasn't enough, because I wanted to get to zero. 30% isn't zero. So I decided I needed to find a way to take out the rest of my emissions. So we created this swipe to net zero. Swipe right, not left. Swipe right to net zero. The way this works is it measured my residual emissions in 2030 and told me how big a forest I would need, forest, not trees, to be able to sink all of my carbon emissions going forward. If I had this much of a forest, my own, at this time, then I would be net zero from that day on. Now, when I say forest, you're all thinking companies, countries, big, millions, tens of millions of trees, hundreds of thousands of hectares. You're thinking saving the tropical savanna. We wanted to atomize this to each individual. So this is a portion of a large forest. We've planted a large forest in the eastern hills of India, and we've taken it out and atomized it so each person can have a part of it for themselves. And you can track it. And this is a forest that lives in a community. You can see the farmers and the livelihoods that are being changed. And we took this approach to say, let's do assets and not offsets, because just like we have cars and homes that are assets and parts of our lives that emit, we should have a part of life that actually absorbs and sinks our carbon. Get to know this group intimately well, and to build a connection with the population that keeps our carbon neutral, takes us to net zero. So that's Minzo. That's my journey to my net zero. You can actually try this out for yourself if you would like. It's available on both the App Store and the Google Play Store. And if you want to try out, experience this in short form, we have a 1-hour experience scheduled for you tomorrow. You can experience a 6-year journey, your own personal net zero journey, tomorrow at 11:30. But really, if you try it and start going, we'd encourage you to create these communities in conversation, communities in action. Because together, we are a really powerful force. We can move investments, we can change markets, we can shape policy, and as Ari and Catherine said this morning, we can write the history of our own climate future. It starts when each of us can grasp the possibility in our own lives. Thank you.